So as a result, our coastal and marine ecosystems are increasingly disturbed. We're losing them at quite a rapid rate, particularly due to development and clearing of foreshore land to build resorts and to put in infrastructure, etc. So what do we do? Well, ecosystem-based adaptation provides a number of options. These are not really maybe not that different from conservation kind of options, but in this case we recognize the climate change adaptation value of investing in these kinds of activities. Here we're talking about mangrove conservation and restoration, conservation and restoration of coastal wetlands, coastal vegetation, seagrass, coral reefs, and our sandy beaches and our dunes, including coastal vegetation, as I mentioned. We're also looking at diversification, protection of ecosystem-based livelihoods, and of course the promotion of ecosystem-based livelihoods as far as possible should be linked into these conservation and restoration programs and activities. Why? Because they provide the motivation for communities to participate in these programs, and it's really critical to have their active participation because they are really often the traditional custodians of these areas, and they engage and live within these areas on a day-to-day basis. So any management, be it through conservation or restoration programs, really requires their active participation and input, and that is greatly enhanced if they can see the everyday livelihood benefits being linked by way of incentive to these programs. Another one would be sustainable fisheries management to try and address the issue of overfishing, coastal waters, coastal areas, marine protected areas we've mentioned, coastal retreats, which are really policy options more applicable to new areas, maybe newly allocated areas for development, where we can actually use the policy option of introducing setback lines and spatial planning by, for instance, saying that no hard infrastructure within 500 meters or within 1 kilometer of the shoreline, and maybe only soft kind of infrastructure measures like ecotourism resorts closer to the water. This gives the ocean and the coastline this chance to move up and down, migrate inland with sea level rise, and sometimes move back out again when during calm conditions, when sand and sediment accretes on our beaches. Living breakwaters are really kind of artificial reefs that some countries utilize to try and derive the ecosystem services that reefs have to offer. It may be in the context of climate change adaptation that they would be looking to for the buffering service that reefs provide to buffer the waves, to reduce the wave energy. But at the same time, these artificial reefs can over time become established through corals and become fully functioning coral reefs, supporting an array of marine organisms and fish, which again can then carry a number of co-benefits for the livelihoods possibilities for local communities. All right, so briefly, just some key success factors when looking at designing ecosystem-based adaptation programs for marine coastal areas. Participatory research is really important to make sure that all stakeholders that are affected, that live in these areas, that have some sort of role to play in these areas, that they are part of the process. And starting off with research is really important so that everybody can understand the data and the evidence that is there, and use that as a baseline to engage in planning. And really problem analysis is really key here. Make sure everyone understands the problem that management interventions are trying to address. Based on problem analysis and the drivers and the causes of the problem, participatory planning is really important, again involving all stakeholders, and drawing on spatial tools like GIS maps. So you can see here on the bottom right, using satellite images and then blowing them up, into large pieces of poster paper and printing them out. These can be really useful tools to focus discussions on particular areas. Make sure that discussions are area-based and spatial, not just hypothetical up in the air. You really need to pin the discussions down to specific areas that we can talk about if you're wanting to find effective area-based solutions. Information that comes out of these planning exercises can be transferred onto GIS maps today fairly easily. This is a particular map of an island in Fiji, Taveuni, which shows different EbA options that were identified for to be appropriate in particular areas on the island. And this then fed into the management plan for the island. We need to make sure we have effective governance arrangements at the local level. In particular, it's the way communities get organized is through governance, and that's where those don't exist through formal government means. They might exist through informal means, through church structures in some Pacific Island countries. They might be more effective in mobilizing people. Maybe good to work through those structures. Traditional structures may be intact, maybe good to work through them. But ideally you want to make sure that your local governance arrangements are linked through to your subnational and national governments, particularly with regard to the different sectors that have a role to play in the coastal zone. We want to make sure that any management that comes out of these processes is adaptive. That means it's able to be flexible, that you revisit plans over time, and you have a regular monitoring system in place whereby these ecosystems are being monitored to see what impact your management activities are having, and if any changes in these ecosystems which may occur, that you're able to identify them quickly, and maybe your management actions need to be changed to address changes. So you need to be prepared to engage in it, what they call adaptive management, and not a rigid kind of management approach. Monitoring, yes, you need to identify indicators that are going to help you to show, indicate the health of your ecosystem and the impact that you're having in terms of your management actions. And you need to go and look and measure and those indicators from time to time as part of a regular monitoring program, which again feeds into adaptive management. And management normally costs some money, depending on what it involves. Some management systems can be more resource intensive than others. We obviously try and keep them as cost effective as possible, so that it's realistic that they can be sustainably supported by local stakeholders. But it's really important that local sources of funding are found, if possible. I mean, if not local, at least national sources, maybe through carbon offsetting or green taxes or the like. Yes, project funding can help set some of these initiatives up. This is donor funds, but we all know that those funds are likely to end after a couple of years, and whereas the costs to continue monitoring and managing those areas will continue. So we really need to find locally based sources of funding to continue to support these processes. Some of the key messages which you could promote within your country context is that healthy ecosystems are the best defense against climate change impacts to livelihoods. So we need to do whatever we can to keep our ecosystems healthy, and that might mean taking proactive management decisions and actions. We need to look at managing the land-based sources of pollution, which affect our coastal areas predominantly through the discharge of rivers into coastal areas. So we need to take a ridge to reef management approach to make sure that we're looking after both the what happens on the land and how that impacts on what happens in the coastal areas. And we need to recognize that some marine species they need rivers for part of their their life cycles, so they need to be able to river ecosystems, freshwater ecosystems need to be healthy enough to support them so that they can travel upriver to when they need to do so. Inland and coastal communities need to manage their actions resources together, so this relates back to reef management. Sometimes inland communities are not aware of the impacts that the land use might be having on coastal areas and waterways, so we need to bring them into the conversation where this is relevant. Public health and livelihoods depend on healthy environments. This is similar to the first point, but also again this links into socioeconomic resilience. We want to make sure our communities stay healthy, particularly relevant during these days of COVID-19 and we have health pandemics. You know, the healthier our population, the more able they are to be resilient and absorb these impacts. And that public health depends a lot on the health of our ecosystems and the food and the water and the air that they breathe, etc. That's derived from those ecosystems. And effectively management depends on good governance and inputs from stakeholders. So, as you mentioned before, we need a high level of participation from all stakeholders, and it needs to be high quality and active input. We need to manage at suitable scales. Often the landscape scale is a good scale to manage at. Where that is possible, we're seeing increasing initiatives to manage marine areas as a seascape. So have to very large areas that are under some form of management, and within that management have different kinds of zones or different kinds of activities. And this is where marine spatial planning also comes in to help identify which zones are best suited for which kinds of activities. We need to make sure we learn from experience and that we build on our knowledge through monitoring and adaptive management, so we don't keep reinventing the wheel. The diagram on the right is really just showing the adaptive management cycle, where you start off with planning, then implementing your management plan, the continuous monitoring, and based on the outcomes of that monitoring, if you notice any changes in the ecosystem, that feeds back into fine-tuning and your management actions to make sure that they're more targeted and they're having the desired outcomes. Every now and then you'll do an evaluation exercise. This is over a longer time period, maybe after 6 years or 1 month, 1 year, or excuse me, say that again, after 6 months or 1 year, or even maybe after 2 years, depends on the program. In the interim, there may have been new data that has been collected, so it gives you an opportunity to feed that new data into your review of the plan and to see if the plan is still on track to achieve the objectives, and then go back into a new cycle of adaptive management.